Good afternoon and welcome everyone joining us for today's webinar on the topic corruption, conflict of interest, and whistleblowing in the public administration. My name is Tatjana Jankovic and I am part of the team from AAYAKA responsible for organizing this webinar from our side, and together with my colleagues, we will guide you through today's discussion. So without further ado, I will introduce today's moderator, Professor Adam Greykar. He has had careers in both academia and the government and has been a professor in the School of Social and Policy Studies at Flinders University, Adelaide, Australia since 2015. Prior to that, he was Professor of Public Policy at the Australian National University and Director of the Transnational Research Institute on Corruption. Over 22 years, he acquired extensive policy experience through senior level posts in both federal and state government. His most recent government position was head of the Cabinet Office in the government of South Australia. Before joining the Australian National University, he was Dean of the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Professor of 2 doctorates from the University of New South Wales, author of around 300 scholarly publications, he's also a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences and member of the Order in Australia. We are very happy to have you with us as a moderator and the speaker today, Adam, and I will give the floor to you now for moderating this event. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tatjana, and thank you, colleagues. We're delighted that so many people have joined us today to talk about a very interesting issue, an issue of corruption in public administration. You know, not the sort of big picture political corruption, but really what happens in government. And I'm going to speak for 15 minutes and each of my panelists will speak for 15 minutes, but we do hope that it raises questions. And if you have a question, if you do have a comment, please place them in the Q&A, not in the chat. The question and answers at the bottom of your screen. So what I'd like to do now is go into the slides that I have and just take you through some of the exercise. Now, tell me, Tatjana, can you see my screen?
Not at the moment, but...
Not at the moment. Isn't this a disaster? We've been practicing all the time and we still haven't been able to get this up as well as we like. Let me try it again now. Are we there?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet? Not yet? You know, we
Okay, now we see your screen.
Now you see the screen.
Yep.
And now
and
we
the
see
presentation.
Slides.
Exactly.
Are we all there? Okay. Sorry for the delay. I don't want to start by defining corruption. I think we get into too difficult a situation there. But what we're really talking about is in a public sector environment, not in a big political environment, essentially, doing things that you shouldn't do, not doing things that you should do, doing stuff that might be permissible, but doing it improperly, and essentially trading in authority. Now, there are many, I've got many examples, but I don't want to spend all my time going through them. But the precipitating factors for a lot of this is when we're dealing with a civil service that may be politicized, or poor salary, or lack of accountability, or too much regulation. And what I want to do is to help you understand how to diagnose, because if we diagnose, if we can understand the components, we can then come to a better understanding of the interventions and the solutions. The first thing, of course, to think about is in your environment, in the public sector environment that you're dealing with, is corruption the exception? Now, I'm from Australia, and by and large, it's the exception. It doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. Whereas in many of the countries that people have come from, corruption is very much the norm. And if we look at, some of the big picture things, we find that those who are not corrupt fight a terrible battle against those who are. The next thing I want you to think about, and it's always important to think about it, is whether we're dealing, is it corruption with theft or corruption without theft? I can give you examples of people who've altered tax records so that people pay less tax and a corrupt bureaucrat may take a cut of that, or inflating a contract, adding 50% to a contract and splitting it with other people. The state loses money. But when we have corruption without theft, for example, the state doesn't lose any money, but it loses. It loses integrity. It loses governance capacity. And let me give you an example. Somebody who hires their relative. Now, somebody had to fill that position anyway, but the process has been undermined. Or, buying, changing data so that goods can come to market more quickly without going through a full customs clearance. There's nothing wrong with the goods, but what happens, the state loses integrity, the company benefits, makes a lot more money because it doesn't have transport costs, storage costs, and so on. So as long as we can think about whether it's corruption with theft, corruption without, whether it's a transgression and something that is out of the ordinary, or whether it is part of the system. The next way to look at it is to start to look at whether we're dealing with corrupt individuals, corrupt groups, corrupt organizations. Now, we all have seen individuals on the make, and there's a strategy when you've got the rotten egg in an organization. But when you've got different groups, that's a different story. Groups of police who conspire together, or a corrupt organization. And this is an interesting thing, can an organization be corrupt? Or a corrupt society? If we look at Lebanon, leading up to the enormous explosion. If we look at Afghanistan, what we see is the embeddedness. If we looked at Indonesia in the Suharto times. So it's very important because we have different controls that come into place when we're dealing with individuals or organizations or societies. And yes, organizations can be corrupt. They can be corrupt largely because of culture, the way the norms are worked out, the way in which new members are told, don't you worry about this, or are socialized into them or supported by their fellow workers. Well, those of you who've read my work, and I know some of you on this webinar will know that I've worked a framework out where I try to look at corruption as different types, different activities, different sectors, and different places. And the important thing to remember is that all corruption is not the same. My colleague Leo Huberts in the Netherlands has talked about 10 different types of public sector corruption. I'm not going to go through them all, but there's a difference through bribing, through, say, sexual harassment, improper use of authority, extortion, fraud. They're all very different. So we've got to understand the different types. But as we're talking today about public administration, in essence, and when you think of the public administration environments that you may work in, the environments you may work in, there are really only 5 things that we do in government, in public administration. We deliver services, we manage money, we buy things, manage people, and regulate things. And so as we start to think of those, we can go back to the types. Do we have bribery in those, in service delivery and human resource management? Do we have fraud? Do we have nepotism? Do we have extortion? Do we have misuse of authority? And then after we go from activities, we go into sectors, and we know, some sectors are more corrupt than others. There's been a lot of work, for example, on police corruption or tax administration or customs administration. So we've got different types of corruption opportunities in different sectors. And we also look at it in different ways, in different places. It doesn't make a lot of sense often to say something like Somalia is more corrupt than Denmark, to think at a national level. That doesn't help us a lot. But sometimes one workplace might be more corrupt than another, one hospital, one police station, or one locality, or one corporation. So what I really want to do is try to, get to understand some of the ranges of these things. So if we can diagnose the issue we've got, if we can diagnose it, the next issue is to be able to say, well, what's the problem? What's the problem that we're dealing with? Is it a bribery problem? Is it a loss of integrity problem? Is it a financial problem? Is it poor services? Because we know, when we've got a huge amount of corruption in any society, or when our public service is corrupted, many things come into play. The quality of services is diminished. There's a lack of investment. There's a lack of trust. People's lives could be at risk. Health opportunities, environmental opportunities. So understanding the problem is important. Understanding the location. Is it at an individual level, a community level? Is it widespread, as I talked about before? But very importantly, who cares? And when nobody cares, or when people accept it as just an inevitability, then we've got a problem. So we need to, locate, identify, and then turn to prevention. If we turn to a range of prevention strategies, and we can do this in organizations, we can talk about how to increase the effort to behave corruptly. The different types of surveillance, different types of supervision, etc. Increase the risk. This is where whistleblowers come into play. We can reduce the rewards through various penalties. We can build and value integrity, because this is a really important part of the whole process. And we can raise awareness. And what I've done in my work, for each of these, we've got numerous examples, numerous case studies that we can evaluate and work out how to deal with all of these things. Now, one of the things also is to try and identify within an organization where what we call the slippage points. Where does it go wrong? Where are the problems? Is it a problem of culture? Yes, sometimes it is. Is it a problem of due process? Processes are important. Sometimes we need to cut corners bureaucratically, but that's important. Sometimes there's temptation, there are easy opportunities to get rich and to do stuff. And sometimes there's just simple managerial incompetence. So it's important to look at those and then understand in our organizations how culturally and process-wise people look at, we have rules, but people sometimes evade the formal rules. You know, they change the procurement process, they avoid bidding altogether, they break things into smaller items so they're not noticeable, or they call on national security or emergency. At other times, people capture the rules, citing special cases or whatever. Sometimes they hollow out the rules, you know, set things up so that only one person could win a contract, for example. Or
Adam,
sometimes even just, yep.
Adam, excuse me, you have one more minute.
Wonderful, that's terrific. So one more minute. And so if we look at how all of these things work, it's important then to look at the differences between system failure, and I've done a lot of this in my research, where we don't even have the rules, and you'll have these slides later, and some system weaknesses. And so what I want to sort of end up with is to say, look, we can look at 3 lines of defense. One is about a culture of integrity. A second is having smart systems in our public administration. And a third is robust and independent assurance. And my final slide is to say that ethical decision-making plays out at 3 different levels: individually, managerially, and organizationally. And I'm very happy to answer questions on these things or share more information with you about those things. So thank you very much, Tanya. And I will then leave my screen now. And I remind you all that you can put questions into the Q&A. So, okay, I've tried to set a scene, but there are different components, you know, issues like conflict of interest and whistleblowing and educating. And so I want to turn next to my colleague, Professor Liz David Barrett, who is Professor of Governance and Integrity at the University of Sussex. And at the University of Sussex in the UK, she's also Director of the Centre for the Study of Corruption. So Liz, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Let me just share my screen and start the slideshow. So thanks very much. As Adam said, I'm going to be focusing particularly on the topic of regulating conflicts of interest in public administration. But first, to tell you a little bit about the Centre for the Study of Corruption at Sussex. We were established in 2012 by my colleague, Professor Dan Huff, who I think is on the call. We were the UK's first academic centre on corruption, and I think remain so, the only one. Our senior team is a mix of academic excellence and practical experience. So myself, I previously was a journalist and educated at the University of Oxford. We have Professor Robert Barrington joined us about 2 years ago, having previously been Executive Director of Transparency International UK, so bringing a lot of practitioner experience, and he's also ex-financial services sector himself. And Professor Dan Huff, who is the head of the politics department at Sussex, an academic who works on the UK, Germany and China in particular, and is particularly an expert in corruption and integrity in the world of sport. So we've got 7 core faculty altogether in the centre, 8 associate faculty, a dozen PhD students, and then we've got 20 master's students who are on campus, as well as around about 120 doing our online master's programme. So essentially we're working in 3 areas. We do research, so undertaking rigorous academic research to address the world's major corruption issues. We are also helping to train the next generation of anti-corruption professionals around the world, along with AAYAKA, of course. And we're engaged in policy. So we're very keen that our research should be policy oriented and should help to make things better and change the world. So on then to conflicts of interest and corruption. And just to say that much of what I'm going to say is in this chapter, which I've put the citation for at the bottom here, which is a chapter in Adam's edited collection, A Handbook on Corruption, Ethics and Integrity in Public Administration. So what do we mean by conflict of interest? Well, a conflict of interest is something that arises where a person or organization has multiple different interests, financial or otherwise. So it could be that they own a company, have a stake in a company, or could be that they're employed by a particular organization. But at the same time, they're in some public service role, so they're in public administration. And so there's a risk that some of their other interests might distort the decisions that they make in their public service role, or might distort the way in which they make their decisions. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of a conflict of interest. So it's important to say then that a conflict of interest is not necessarily corrupt. What a conflict of interest is, and its relationship with corruption, is that there's a risk that corruption could occur as a result of having a conflict of interest. So we're really making two assumptions here. One is that these conflicts are inevitable. Anyone who's in public service, of course, they're going to have, other interests in their life, but we're also assuming that they're manageable through regulation. And so what I want to talk about a lot today is around those tensions in how we manage them and how we regulate conflicts of interest. The first point I want to make, though, is that the risks are increasing. And that's because of three trends happening in public administration around the world. And the first that's very noticeable is the increased outsourcing of public service provision through competitive tendering and public-private partnerships. So this is something that we've seen, very much started, I think, in the West in the 90s. Australia and the UK are both examples of countries that have done a lot of outsourcing, but also very much seen more frequently now in lower and middle income countries as well. And this creates more conflicts of interest because companies are interested in gaining insider information about that tendering process so that they can increase their chances of winning those contracts. Also, public officials who are in the position of allocating those contracts and even deciding what will be put out to tender have quite a lot of discretionary power. So I think this increases the risks and the conflicts of interest that arise. The second risk then that's increasing is that there's much more movement through what is often called the revolving door. So individuals no longer go into public service as a career for life. They often move in between public sector and private sector roles in the course of their career. And so this also creates risks. There are risks that public officials might abuse their office while they're in power to favour certain companies and try to ingratiate themselves with those companies in order to get a job offer. And there are also risks that people in public service who are in a regulatory role might be more sympathetic to the sector that they're regulating because they used to be in that sector. And there's a host of other conflicts of interest associated with the revolving door, which I set out in that chapter in the book. And then thirdly, I think what we're also seeing is that we've got private professional services companies who are often deeply conflicted because they're often suppliers to government of many public services and consultancy, but they're also often operating as auditors of government. And so they are disincentivized from being tough auditors or from asking probing questions for the fear of losing other or future business in these other areas. So if we've got increasing risks, how do we think about regulating them? And essentially we have three regulatory tools in our toolbox. One is what is known as incompatibility rules. So we completely ban public officials from holding certain kinds of positions. So we might ban them from being an owner of a company or a shareholder, for example, or similarly, we might ban them from holding other public roles at the same time. So one interesting thing is whether you can be both a public servant and be holding, sitting on the board of another public body or a state-owned enterprise. Secondly, we use recusal. So this is removing yourself from a conflict on a case-by-case basis. So this is where you're conducting your normal job, but you might say, I can't work on this particular project because I have a conflict. So you withdraw yourself from those particular decisions. That's called recusal. And then the third one is declarations of interest. So this is really not so strict. It's not saying we're not going to ban it, we're not going to remove you from the decision making, but we are going to ask you to declare everything, and we're going to publish those declarations. And then this is essentially an approach that relies on public accountability to hold you to account and make sure that that conflict doesn't turn into corruption. Now, I think the tension here is that all of these approaches rely to some extent on individuals recognizing and declaring their own conflicts. We are trusting people to make personal judgments. And my question then is, how are individuals making those judgments? And can we in fact trust them to make the right judgments? And I think there are a couple of problems here. The first one is, in conflict of interest regulation, we often ask people to think about the appearance standard. So this is just actually a quote from the UK House of Commons Code of Conduct. And it asks individuals to declare a financial interest if it might reasonably be thought by others to influence their speech, representation, or communication. And this notion of the appearance standard is very common in conflict of interest regulation. This is the guidance that is given to individuals about how to recognize whether they have a conflict and to then take that sort of regulatory action, recusing themselves or declaring, for example. And I think there's a good reason for that. It reflects a sense that actually public confidence is affected not only by whether there is an actual conflict or corruption, but also about how conduct appears. So it's important that there's the appearance too of integrity. But the difficulty is that it also assumes a consensus on how the public will perceive a potential conflict. And it sometimes leads to quite absurd demands on individuals, in that we're asking them to imagine how something might be perceived by others and allow for that, even when there's little actual chance of conflict. So again, in the chapter, I talk about an example where you see some of this sort of absurd, convoluted situations that this gets people into in terms of how to manage that appearance standard. The second big problem is unconscious bias. So we're assuming when we ask individuals to make these personal judgments that office holders can recognize their own conflict of interest, that they accept that it might influence their judgment, and then that they're able to isolate their decisions from any such influences. But actually what we know from research from psychology is that we have many unconscious biases. And so, we see this, for example, in, we might absolutely think of ourselves as someone who is not racist, and yet perhaps we're making automatic assumptions about people of different races. We might absolutely think that we're not discriminating on the basis of gender, but maybe we make assumptions about, someone in a particular profession is likely to be of a certain gender or something like that. So we have these kinds of biases. And in particular, there are a few that I think are relevant to this conflict of interest. One broad one is this sense that we often think fast rather than think slow. We fail to reflect, and this can lead to us having ethical blind spots where we just sort of assume and make a shortcut towards a decision without really reflecting on the potential risks. Secondly, we suffer from motivated reasoning, and that's where our self-interest influences our understanding of reality and often allows us to justify our own wrongdoing. So again, there's research on this, which I've cited here, and I can include the citations in the presentation that we share. And there are also the fact that many of the conflicts of interest in public administration are actually quite complex and quite ambiguous. So they're difficult judgments. And we also know from research that when there's ambiguity, then there's more room for individuals to kind of invent justifications for why it's okay to do something that might actually be seen as wrongdoing. So those are the kind of relevant biases. There's also a certain school of thought that says, well, maybe public officials might be better at being impartial. Again, it seems to me that the evidence on this is not very strong or encouraging. So it seems there are some individuals who identify themselves as good people. They see themselves as more moral and unbiased. And that can actually mean that they're, again, not seeing the conflicts and how they're affecting their decision making. We also know that the norms of your group matter. So if you're part of a group of cheaters in an experimental situation, then you're more likely to cheat. And you're also more likely to accept cheating by others in your group. So this creates a tension in a situation where there is high corruption. And similarly, there's some research which suggests that in high corruption societies, the kind of people who actually decide to go into public service are often people who are more driven by personal financial gain than public service. So once you've got a corrupt norm, it's somewhat self-perpetuating. My conclusion from this is that group norms really matter. And then the challenge for us as regulators is, can we create the right kind of group norms to get the right kind of behavior and the right kind of virtuous circle? And just one small piece of research which I find quite encouraging on this is an experiment that was conducted with art critics and with regular lay members of the public. Very small sample, they're using MRIs, but it's an encouraging result. What they find is they're showing people examples of works of art, and they ask them to put a value on each work of art. They also showed the logos of 2 companies, and they tell them that the experiment, for which they're being individually paid for taking part, is being sponsored by one of these companies. They then put logos on some of the works of art and not on others. And what they find is that the regular lay people tend to value higher the pieces of art that have the sponsor's logo on. So it suggests that they are in fact unconsciously influenced by the sponsor. However, for the art experts, that effect is much weaker. And so I think this possibly shows that what we can do is build up professional norms which do help people to overcome the bias, because they can fall back on those professional standards as their baseline.
1 minute, Liz.
Perfect. So just to conclude then, conflicts of interest in public administration are absolutely inevitable. We're not going to ever escape them. And in fact, they're probably becoming more prevalent. Our methods for regulating them and preventing them from turning into corruption rely very much on personal judgment. And I think we need to recognize that and recognize that personal judgment is not perfect, and it's going to be affected by a number of situational factors, including group norms. But that leads me to conclude that we should focus our efforts more on building the right group norms, more on building professional standards for public office holders, and not so much on just making more and more complicated regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was a very thoughtful compilation of ideas, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss. And might I remind people, if you have a question or a comment, please post it in the Q&A and not in the chat. So moving from conflict of interest, which has always been interesting because nearly all people who are accused of conflict of interest vehemently deny it and say, no, there was no conflict at all, and probably genuinely believe so. I want to move now to whistleblowing, and our next speaker is Gideon Onyango. And Gideon is lecturer in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. So Gideon, if you'd unmute yourself, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Let me just upload let me just share my screen. Using 2 devices, so yes, I hope it can be seen now. Good.
Yes, it is.
Yes. Yep. Right. Okay. Good. Yes, can you see it properly?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Today, following what Adam has discussed, which was very insightful.
We can't hear you.
Of corruption and anti-corruption. Let me put my speaker closer. Okay. Can you now hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you, Gideon.
Hello?
Yep.
Yes. So I will proceed with an area that is currently gaining attention from scholars and actually also international development actors. That is whistleblower protection, a component of finding ways of how to protect those who have unearthed or have disclosed a wrongdoing within an organization. And I will give special attention prospects in developing countries. I focus on giving nuanced examples from Brazil, Ghana, and South Africa, among others. But for this purpose, because of the time, I will just focus on main points. I developed a paper on this, and I think it will be shared by the organizers once we are done with this webinar. I will start with focusing on what is whistleblower. As the disclosure of a wrongdoing that touches on public interest within a public institution, but it focuses on also an intricate area of also
Gideon, I can't hear you. This is Adam. I can't hear you very well. Tanya, I don't know whether you can hear clearly, or is it just my hearing at this end?
Yeah, it seems like there is an issue with the connection, unfortunately.
Yes, I think so. It is the internet connectivity, and it's very bad. It is only happening when I'm presenting. All the time, it was very good.
Okay, well, back to you then.
So can you? Oh yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much. There are critical components of whistleblowing, and first is that it has to entail a disclosure of a wrongdoing, and it has to touch on public interest. And in the process of doing so, to regulate who should whistleblow and what qualifies as a wrongdoing. Countries all over the world, though not popularly pursued, have developed whistleblower protection policies or legislation that define clearly what qualifies as an act of wrongdoing, and sometimes also who is supposed to report it for an action to be pursued within the public context. But however, there are a lot of challenges that are still surrounding an issue of whistleblower protection. And first, it goes back to the complexity of the intricacies or whistleblowing intricacies, what I call whistleblowing intricacies or complexities, because it is not very certain the motivations of the whistleblower, especially in the developing context where the public interest is not clearly defined. There is also a challenge with the burden of proof that comes with ensuring that the whistleblower is not motivated in otherwise than public interest. Then there is also an assumption that the norms of public service or the norms of public administration and values matches that of the personnel or of the society, which is an issue that is increasingly complex in the developing world. Then there's also complexity of the intentions or motivations. There are also a lot of deficits when it comes to whistleblower protection and infrastructure in developing countries. And this also is accompanied by institutional culture that is not in support of whistleblower protection. So much as whistleblower protection is ideally a complex issue internationally, in developing countries, we experience an additional problem that generally relates to the uniqueness of the context of these countries. So when you look at whistleblower protection as a concept, it is underpinned in the human rights concept. which actually is being promoted largely within the democratic principles. In if the state is democratic, then therefore
we're losing you again.
The case. Okay. I've tried to remove the video so that it doesn't disturb, but can you now hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Right. Now, whistleblower protection to work effectively, there is a need for democratic administration, and that one means there has to be value for administrative openness. There has to be value for administrative transparency. There has to be value for accountability, reputation, responsiveness in a public service. And we know that these are values that in themselves sometimes are overlapping. And also when it comes to developing world where the state tradition is still largely autocratic, they increasingly become a challenge to enhance within the public sector. So it therefore naturally means that the public sector is ill-disposed to enhance whistleblower protection in this context. So whistleblower protection as safeguarding whistleblowers from all forms of retaliation is therefore very complex in our settings of developing countries, and is largely legalistic. It becomes very challenging to protect whistleblowers from other components that come with whistleblowing, which is largely a moral backlash. And we see that in most cases, much as yes, whistleblowers are might be ethical in their intentions, they might also consider, as research shows, the moral backlash or the responses from their colleagues and their bosses alike. So whistleblower protection within that context is defined by both the structures, which sometimes are ill-defined, and also the cultures, which in themselves are very complex to locate within the public sector, given that the public sector has layers of authorities and sometimes overlapping, and sometimes also laws that are vague in some instances, as Adam has already demonstrated in his definition of corruption. So there are particular policy tools that can be used ideally within a legalistic framework that are always being used to promote whistleblower protection in public administration, and I've drawn, I've sized them in that table. And there are definitional features that need to be very clearly articulated. There are issues of policy design, and there are issues of policy instruments. Although my table is not exhaustive, but these are some of the major components that I regard as the infrastructure of whistleblowing protection in the public administration. I will focus on these policy instruments that are increasingly being used to ensure that whistleblowers are protected. We know that we are in the era of public governance, and the public administration is characterized by a lot of agentification, and whistleblower protection as a policy takes on that line of organizing tasks, of creating, of dividing competent within public administration. So there is increased use of what we refer as competent authorities, institutional agencies that are supposed to be hosting policy agency, policy institution for the implementation and for the coordination of whistleblower protection policies in the public sector. There is always also an increase of applying different legislation, because we know that the issue of corruption, for example, that whistleblower is dealing with, or any other wicked problem that are regarded to be going against or threatening public interest, they are always very complex in the public sector. They are generally having a lot of a multi-layer of regulations or laws, which at some point may be intricate in themselves, or may be overlapping in themselves, at the same time creating a problem that we'll talk about later. But therefore, this is where it can be applicable, because sometimes these laws are hosted or are being enforced institutions or within the public sector, like the task force for anti-human trafficking, there is task force fighting drug abuse, and all these environment for complementarity so that an effective action can be taken against a wrongdoer or protecting the whistleblower in the public realms. Is what others have called a collective action or stakeholder consultations, especially when it comes to how to improve the effectiveness of legislations and how they can be applied. So the governments and actors involved in whistleblower protection in this framework where British enforce these laws, bringing in different agencies and even private actors on board so that whistleblowers can be effectively protected, or the law can be effectively improved or enforced within the public sector. Now, the most critical component, increasingly becoming also a problem in the public sector of the developing world, is an issue of citizen participation. How effectively are citizens involved in setting an agenda for whistleblowing, or in drafting those laws, or in ensuring that they are aware, especially they are aware of these laws, because this will be very important in enhancing what we call the citizen oversight. So there is also an element as a policy instrument. I regard it as a policy instrument because countries like Ghana apply citizen participation effectively so that whistleblowers are protected. So there's another element of legal advice, and the legal advice here usually it is hazy, but in most cases it enhances confidence in the potential whistleblowers because they'll be guided through the milky legal process. So these are some of the tools that I consider to be very prominent in ensuring or in promoting whistleblower protection in the developing world. I will also move to looking at now whistleblower protection in developing countries. And when looking for these challenges in developing countries, I think we should context of governance. It also relates to the fact that these countries are still developing and also they are still democratic. And these in themselves comes with the challenges that we've witnessed years before they became what we know. So, being that they're still developing, they are having unique and context-specific variables which actors or governments dealing with. But at the same time, because they are still democratizing, and democratization is largely being enforced from outside, they are also dealing with actors in the international development. And the mixture that comes on board creates a lot of confusion, increased when it comes to implementing, especially actions that are often being sponsored by international development organizations and governments. There is pressure within and there is pressure without that these actors need to deal with. Unlike in the West, probably, where you have more side and you focus more in the inside than focusing on the outing world, actors have to balance both the developing problems and democratic challenges, which are at some point also are not easy to bring together or to balance, so that we can create an environment where whistleblowing or good governance environment can be enhanced. So
Gideon,
we are out.
Your time
Time is up.
About up. Yep. So can you just
Okay.
very quickly finish up?
Yes, I think let me now look at the these are now the challenges, the mismatch between administrative and societal norms. There are institutional deficits. We are still dealing with issues of colonial legacies when it comes to definition or handling whistleblowers. Then we have ignorant and corrupt citizenry. What I saw Adam was talking about, corrupt society. So there is this corrupt society or corrupt citizenry where there's a lot of the norm of corruption within the society, to an extent that a whistleblower might be seen as the odd one out, and therefore this also poses an extra cultural implication when it comes.
Okay, Gideon, I think we might have to finish it there. We can see you've laid out some prospects for improvement. Yep, and we'll have these slides available for everybody afterwards, and we might have some questions as well. You've laid out, quite a comprehensive strategy there, so that's looking good. So look, thank you very much, and I'm sorry, I've had to cut you off. We're sort of, working to a very tight time frame, but there are questions, and I remind everybody, please to put your questions in the Q&A. Well, our fourth speaker, our final speaker on the panel is Eugene Choi. And Eugene is from AAYAKA. She's head of training and capacity development department in the International Anti-Corruption Academy. And I think what we've seen from each of the presentations so far, that the really key and structured way through is not in having more rules, not in having more laws, but rather in more training, more education, and more capacity building. So Eugene, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. I will share my screen. Okay. Thank you, everyone, to join our webinar today. And it's my great pleasure to be together with the renowned lecturers and speakers whom I really invited in our training most of the times. Liz and also Adam are our lecturers as well from our department trainings as well. And before starting the presentation, I will introduce myself briefly as well. I'm serving AAYAKA at the moment, but I am actually anti-corruption practitioner myself, and I worked with a Korean government anti-corruption agency over 10 years, and then I joined AAYAKA after 11th year and serving AAYAKA for 6 years now, and I started my 7th year this month. So let me start my presentation. I will briefly introduce AAYAKA to everyone, but I think everybody knows AAYAKA pretty well. So my presentation for AAYAKA is a very brief. AAYAKA is an international intergovernmental organization and post-secondary education institution in topics of anti-corruption and compliance. And we are celebrating our 10th anniversary this year, and we have 80 member states. Out of that, 76 are UN member states and 4 are international organizations. And we are providing trainings and also the education programs for the professionals for the fighting against the corruption, for the prevention and combating as well. And we also conduct the research functions, and we do provide a technical assistance and consulting services as well, and cooperations and networking venue for the practitioners. And our goal, utmost goal, is the empowering professionals. So we are not really teaching the students, but then our participants are anti-corruption practitioners and compliance officers. You can see the map here, and it's visually showing who are AAYAKA parties in the navy blue, and the light blue is our signatories. And AAYAKA is working with many international organizations, including UN and UNITAR and OECD, OSCE, World Bank, Interpol, and WEF, and also the anti-corruption agencies and government offices from the member state and also the non-member states. This is just to showing the AAYAKA governing structure. We have assembly of parties and once a year, and we do also have a board of governors, and the dean is taking care of our daily works at AAYAKA Secretariat. And we do also have an international senior advisory board and an international academic advisory board. And now I will jump into the anti-corruption and compliance education and training. So what's happening under the pandemic situation in particular. Anti-corruption and compliance education previously considered as a public sector phenomena and then focused more on the public sector, but these days we are moving toward and also increasingly receive the request from the private sector because it's viewed as the corporate, as the center of the focus. And one of the questions in the Q&A is also asking, are we really doing some intervention for the supply side of the corruption? Yes, we do. We do the prevention part here. And also there is an international convention like OECD Anti-Bribery Convention is also targeting the supply side of the corruption. And as you can see, there are internal trainings and external trainings, and there is overlapping in between. And we are receiving a lot of requests from the tailor-made trainings. And in this case, we are checking what are their internal trainings, what they covered internally, what training they do have already. And then we are building upon what's existing so that we are not overlapping again and again for the same things, but we are building on from the external expert and also the content to their existing knowledge. And in particular, during the pandemic era, we experienced the huge challenges, and we consider this might be also the opportunities as well, because we were traditionally really strong with a face-to-face training at AAYAKA, and then many other institutions and universities are also having a face-to-face lectures and trainings to the practitioners and students. But due to the pandemic, and we are unable to meet each other, so that everything has to be moved to the virtual. But there are some merit and also some advantages by doing so as well when we are doing it. Initially, it was very challenging for all of us to get used to and how to use the Zoom and also the communicating through this platform. But now we are gaining more and more knowledge and experience and feel more comfortable to use this as the venue to communicate, even for the group discussion. I will give a little bit more details in the next few slides. So during the pandemic era, anti-corruption education and training can be a little bit more flexible because it can be cost efficient. And also I can include the diverse topics and then choose the different speakers in the different time zone without considering and worrying about the travel expenses or the different time zone. Now we are in many different time zones, for example, for this webinar tonight. From my side, it's night, but for some of you, it's in the morning and during the day. So then we are also facing some challenges and then issues for how much of the time should be dedicated for the live versus self-paced. So that finding an optimum balance between live and self-paced or the prerequisite session is the challenge. And then we were concerning about the discussion at the beginning, but as I mentioned before, previous slide, and we learned that in the small breakout session, we realized that we could have extensive discussion opportunities as well. And what kind of a teaching method and learning method we are using, and then we are providing reading materials in advance, and then we do have a live classes, and we do have a prerecorded lectures, and also we leave the discussion forum so that even before and after the training and people can mingle and then communicate and exchange their knowledge through this discussion forum. And lastly, but not the leastly, the self-assessment became more and more relevant and important and carries more significant meaning because a lot of companies and also the organizations would like to have a pre-assessment and then aftermath assessment. Previously, we were doing the aftermath only, but then now we are focusing what they are knowing before the training and then what do they learn aftermath, and just want to compare this so that we are doing the self-assessment as a more importance these days. And academic program has been already covered by colleague Marie extensively, so I'm not really repeating this part, but we are having 3 different master's program and we are still accepting applications, so you can check our webpage. And now I will go to, and then intake is the yearly. And this shows our alumni network. AAYAKA alumni is over 3,500 people from the 160 over countries and jurisdictions. You can see this, the navy color is all our alumni network. And for the short-term trainings, which I am responsible, we do have a standardized open trainings, which is the yearly provided training, and tailor-made training. And we do develop open training, open online trainings, both instructor-led and self-paced courses over the pandemic period. And our upcoming some of the open trainings, which we call standardized program as well, is our Summer Academy, which is having about 60 participants registered, and we are expected to run our program from just a few days after 4th to the 10th of September. But this is unfortunately virtual once again. This is our 2nd time virtual online Summer Academy. And also, my colleague Marie mentioned there will be a new master's program with the UNITAR, but at the same time, we are also developing AAYAKA UNITAR Executive Diploma Program for in anti-corruption and diplomacy, which is will be launching at the end of September as well. And we do also have a best of a seminar with Pascal Dubois, the former vice president of the INT of the World Bank in November. I am a visual person. I like pictures. So this shows my Summer Academy participant. And we do have a 10th Summer Academy last year, but unfortunately virtual. But until 9th, we were having face-to-face and together at AAYAKA. And we have last 10 years, over 600 participants from the more than 120 countries. And other than Summer Academy, we also offer regional Summer Academies, which is more focused on the regional topics and issues and challenges they are facing. And our last Summer Academy, due to the pandemic, was the 2019. We had 2 editions, one in my hometown, where I am, South Korea, South and East Asia Regional Summer Academy. And then we had one other in Brazil, Sao Paulo, for the Latin America, Central and South America. And I'm really hoping that we can have our regional Summer Academy and Summer Academy face-to-face next year. And tailor-made trainings are coming from the private sector and public sector, and also the international organization. Most recently, we had a tailor-made training with the OSCE with their member state border control and customs officials. And then we also had a tailor-made training with the new development bank, or so-called BRICS Bank, STEP members and the member states. And these are the potential topics. You will have a PowerPoint, but this is not the exhaustive list, and we can cover more topics than this. But the most important part is that we are really targeting what's important needs and also the niche from our clientele, and then we are back and forth communicating to identify the topics for the trainings. And I would like to discuss a little bit about our open online trainings. We do have 2 different kinds, and instructor-led is a little bit longer term, so 3 to 6 weeks of the online courses with a synchronous and asynchronous learning materials. So there are some materials that's available for the pre-study and also the live session with a lecture. And then some of the topics here, and then you can find the different languages as an option. And also the self-paced online courses are the ones which is available there, and professionals can pick and choose whatever their schedule and then pace, and they can enhance their knowledge for the anti-corruption and compliance. And some of these courses are free of charge and others are fee-based. So please do visit our homepage and check out the courses. And we do at the moment an English and the Russian version, but we are working on the procurement courses with one of the UNOPS UN bodies for the procurement responsible body. And AAYAKA and UNOPS developed having this online course for free of charge pretty soon. And this will be many different languages, including Spanish and Arabic and French at the moment. We are working on it. And for the last few slides, I would like to make a connection between the research in anti-corruption and compliance and how we are using the research in our course. One of our core is, and the mandate is the research on anti-corruption and compliance and collective action. And our research is very much practically oriented, and then we are using the research outcomes in our technical assistance programs and in our anti-corruption training programs. And we are closely working with our research department colleague and inviting him as a lecturer and working and developing course topics together with him. And research for the research at AAYAKA, what we are doing at the moment is a global research network establishment is a work in progress. And we are also working on the repository of the research on anti-corruption, compliance, and collective action. And we are also working on the research paper series at AAYAKA. So thank you for your attention. I hope I kept my 15 minutes.
Perfectly on time, Eugene. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
You did indeed. Well, thank you very much for outlining the full range of educational opportunities. It's very important because, you know, what is very interesting, we have people from all over the world here. There is no one issue that solves every problem. It's not, there are some things that many places have in common, and there are others that are very different. And we have a lot of questions. And let me just explain how I want to proceed for the next few minutes. There were many questions. We won't be able to answer all of the questions individually, but many of the questions asked for practical approaches. For example, to ask Liz David Barrett, you know, what sorts of group norms, for example, you know, might one be able to put into an organization? And to ask Gideon, for example, what sorts of policy design and what sorts of instruments work best in these? And somebody also asked me, you know, whether there are examples of things that have worked, and I can, you know, explain for some considerable time. But look, I'll ask Liz, then Gideon, and then I want to turn to my colleague, AJ Brown, who's from Griffith University and on the board of Transparency International, to make a couple of comments and deal with you know, some of the issues that have come up. So Liz first for a couple of minutes, then Gideon, and then I'll call on AJ Brown.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam. So examples of success stories around building and changing group norms. I think there are actually quite a few, but a couple of things I want to mention. There's a great NGO in Nigeria called Step Up Nigeria, and they are working partly with children. I noticed one of the questions was about getting people interested early and changing norms early. So they're partly going into schools and doing exercises around ethics and integrity and corruption in schools, but they're also working with public officials and just getting them to do things like role playing, thinking through implications of acting in certain ways. And so I think that's a really interesting, it's quite new, it's a local initiative, but that's something I would definitely suggest you look up, Step Up Nigeria. Similarly, I examined recently a PhD on the tax authority in Indonesia. Some really interesting stories there. There was a combined sort of tone at the top, up sort of downward pressure in that there was some World Bank support for tax reform, but then there were a lot of initiatives within the tax authorities which were much more about building integrity, getting people to change their practices, combination of sort of a little bit more nudges and oversight. So things around getting people to clock in so that you could tell when people were coming in, having eyes on the wall, which were suggesting oversight, but also a lot more team building and positive integrity building work. And then finally, I've just mentioned Jamaica, where I've been involved in working with law enforcement agencies, historically had a problem of police corruption. They've set up some new agencies where they've been recruiting. So, you know, one of the difficulties is around how do you deal with a deep embedded police corruption problem. So partly they've been doing extensive vetting, but also they've been recruiting people fresh out of university and then institutionalizing them and socializing them into a new set of norms and getting them working in a different kind of culture. So just a few examples from different parts of the world there, which I think are worth looking at.
Great, thanks, Liz. So Gideon, please. You're muted. Please unmute yourself.
I hope that now
we can only just hear you. Maybe turn your camera off to give you a bit better sound. Gideon, I'm afraid we can't hear you. What I might do while we're getting you fixed is turn to AJ Brown, who not only is a member of the Board of Transparency International, but a world authority on whistleblowing as well. AJ, would you like to make a few comments about the presentations and some of your responses, please?
Sure, thank you, Adam, and it's very good to be with you all. And I hope we haven't heard the last from Gideon because I think his contribution is especially important. I want to thank all the presenters for the information and also for all the questions. And I hope that you'll be able to answer all the questions individually as well, because I think they're very interesting. I was, to my mind, I guess the overall comment that I would have on where this discussion sort of tends to land us on corruption in public administration is first and foremost just the vital importance of understanding what it takes to fight corruption in and in its context. And I was really, really learned a lot from Gideon's presentation and your analysis of what whistleblower protection means and the challenges in developing countries. I think that's really, really valuable. And it really reinforced to me, I guess, the message that Liz is saying about the role of norms in context in institutions. It really reinforced to me that the answer does not lie in trying to import particular models, particular laws, or even particular legislative standards or institutions to try and achieve whistleblower protection in different contexts. It really starts with those norms. And I guess my reaction to Gideon would be to say that even in a corrupt society, we know that that people in society in general know about right and wrong, and that the definition of what the public interest is and what you're protecting has to be based on the public understanding of what is right and what is wrong, above and beyond importing definitions of wrongdoing, etc. But that actually takes me back to Liz and how we define conflicts of interest. And I saw some questions really touched upon this. That I really agree with Liz's analysis that it's group norms and professional standards that are, again, the bedrock of achieving improvement in how we regulate, recognise, minimise corruption based on conflicts of interest. But it really struck me that we really operate very often from a Western perspective in particular, with a very dichotomised view of the conflict of interest between individualised self-interest, the individual as personal self-interest, and then a very general idea of the public interest. and we're not so good at understanding and building in concepts of community interest and familial interest and different cultural variations in collective group interests that very often are at the heart of the conflict, and matter much more and much stronger in many societies than, unfortunately, they're not strong enough in places like Australia or the UK or the US very often. And so I guess I wonder if that's a big challenge for us, adapting our frameworks of conflicts of interest to achieve what you're saying in a lot of environments where corruption really is a really big problem. Which I guess that my final reflection, moving from that back to Adam, was, and I could see the questions in the chat about how does this work in highly corrupt societies or regimes where the state is captured. You know, Adam, your first point was we need a culture of integrity, yes, and your first point was politicization of the public service can be a big problem. But what do we do when the entire public service is not just politicized, but it's captured and it's part of a system of patronage? And obviously, you know, our Transparency International chapters and many of our participants from all around the world are dealing with those sorts of environments. And I guess that's the main question that I would keep throwing back to you is that, and certainly that's what so much of what Transparency International is trying to achieve, is there's an enormous political component to achieving control of corruption in public administration in terms of leadership, political leadership, and achieving that long-term culture of integrity that will actually change those really fundamental power dynamics in many countries for the type of healthy integrity in public administration that we espouse to actually be able to take hold and flourish. So I think your presentations really bring out those really, really big challenges really nicely. I don't know whether you want to react to some of those big challenges that have been in the questions.
Well, before I do, I just want to hand back to Liz for a moment. She'd like to respond to you in a quick moment, and then I'll try and sum up some of the issues.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I just had a couple of reflections actually prompted by some of your comments, AJ. The one was, you know, around the kind of local norms, Western norms, etc. So I wanted to bring up a couple of things from experience of working in Ghana. So one was, a couple of years ago, an investigative journalist uncovered that the head of the public procurement regulatory authority in Ghana was also owning a lot of companies which were being directly awarded contracts. I think this is an example of a conflict of interest, which we would all say is just, you know, that can't be right. So that's something which I think, you know, could be outlawed in law. It's going to be difficult to enforce, partly because of lack of beneficial ownership transparency, and it's difficult to know who owns companies. But at least if you've outlawed it in law, you've put down the benchmark. A more subtle case I came across in Ghana was an interview I did with someone who was a very senior, high integrity official who said, look, there's a difference between giving a contract to a friend at an inflated price and giving a contract to a friend at the market price. And he was comfortable with the latter. And I thought, you know, that was very interesting. And, you know, clearly it's a little bit like Adam was talking about, you know, there's corruption with theft and without theft. So he was essentially arguing that this was corruption without theft, which we might still argue is distorting, you know, the way that he does his job. You know, is this company really the best one for the job, etc. But there's a difference there, and, you know, maybe, you know, we need to think about these slight differences in how we're thinking about things. And then just your question about captured states. That is a really difficult situation, but I really liked what you said about there's always people with integrity. And I've been looking a little bit lately at the case of South Africa, where clearly we've had an example of massive state capture, but you still had individuals who stood up against it. So there was a Minister of Finance, Mhlanhla Nene, who stood up against a particular decision to build a nuclear power station. Yeah, this is a fantastic example of integrity in a really difficult situation. And I think, you know, we've got to reward and recognise those examples and make it more possible for more and more people to come forward in that kind of way, even in really difficult contexts.
Thanks very much, Liz. Before I wrap up, which I'll do in just a couple of minutes, I just wanted to check whether Gideon and Eugene have any final comments they'd like to make. Gideon, would you You're muted.
Yes, hello, can you hear me now?
We've lost you again.
I've put some, okay. This is embarrassing. Oh, okay. I've tried the questions by typing online.
Okay.
Hello?
I mean, there are many questions that have been directed. If you would be able to answer those directly, I'm sure people would be very happy. Eugene, any final comments from you?
Actually, because I am from the anti-corruption agency myself, and one of the questions is about the whistleblower protection to Gideon, but I do also have some experience, so I can give a brief answer for that. And how do they push the politicians to enact the whistleblower protection legislation was the question. And we do have a whistleblower protection for the public sector, but we did really miss the part that for the private sector. In this case, Gideon mentioned in his presentation about the public interest as one of the way to put it in. And in Korea, by putting the public interest part in the as a new special legislation for the whistleblower, and we do cover the private sector as well. So that's one of the way to move toward. And then also that there was a recommendation made by the OECD Working Group on bribery, which was used as a leverage to push our legislature. And there was a follow-up for this recommendation by the OECD Working Group. This peer pressure was really helping when we were really enacting this additional private sector whistleblower protection from our side. So that's just a short experience from my side.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you all speakers. We haven't even started to answer. There are many, many questions that aren't answered, but there's a theme that's come through a number of questions, and that is we have a lot of corruption, particularly in poorer countries, and you know, what comes first? I often, when I'm teaching courses, I often start with a discussion, a very famous discussion between two eminent people that ask the question, does corruption cause poverty, or does poverty cause corruption? And as we start to unpack that, you can look at some of the dynamics. The second point I wanted to make is that corruption varies enormously, and we work on a model that we assume in many cases that the principal is not corrupt, but sometimes the agent is corrupt. And as AJ pointed out, what if the principal is also corrupt? In other words, the whole process is gone. The one thing that doesn't work in those situations are more laws and more rules, because it is not possible. It is just not possible to make a rule or make a law against every possible infraction or issue that might come up. And so if the more laws you have, the more people work around the laws. And people have known that for thousands of years. Will we ever be able to eliminate corruption? Some people have asked that question. And the answer is no, we're not going to eliminate corruption. We're going to redefine it. What was acceptable behavior 20 years ago in many places is not acceptable behavior today. If we go back 200 years ago, some of the most corrupt countries were in Scandinavia. Sweden was monumentally corrupt. Denmark was monumentally corrupt. Today, these are considerably less corrupt. If we go back even in my own country, in Australia, 20, 30 years ago, there were police organisations that were very corrupt. Today, they're a lot less corrupt. So changes can take place, and to assume that a change can take place very, very quickly is sometimes a very difficult thing. As Liz pointed out, it's very largely about norms. We've done some research in Australia on making corrupt organisations less corrupt, and I'm happy if anybody wants to email me to share some of that with you. But really, we're dealing with a three-level type issue. You know, on the one hand, we need to provide guidance, cultural support, strong organisational leadership. And that leadership, and that's different to management. And at the second level, good quality management, transparent management, objectives that are clear, that work through coordination. And at the third level, some elements of control and coercion. And it's how different societies blend those together. Sometimes you need more coercion, and a little less guidance. Sometimes guidance, if the culture is there, will do it. Now, we've spent an hour and a half trying to deal with monumental issues that have been with us for thousands of years. Hopefully, with all of the work that you're all doing individually, with all of the work that you're doing in your organizations, through your education, through working in different public sector environments, teaching it, sharing it, hopefully we can make some progress. And don't be despondent if you're not going to change the world immediately, but very, very thoughtfully. I think if we can look very much at cultural issues, at control issues, at legal issues, blend them together, we can make progress together. And then we can learn from AAYAKA more about how to do things. So thank you very much, everybody. Titania, do you want to have a final word here?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you to all the panelists and to AJ for wrapping up the discussion. I just want to underline that this was not an AAYAKA webinar. This is a jointly organized webinar by the Stretton Institute of the University of Adelaide and the University of Sussex. And obviously, this discussion has really sparkled some questions which were have not been able to be answered in this particular forum. So we will either try to collect all the answers from our panelists and communicate to the participants of this webinar, or alternatively, maybe organize a similar event in due time and discuss further about the particularities of the corruption, conflict of interest, and whistleblowing in the public sector. So with this, I would like to thank you for participating in this event, and see you next time. We will soon have another webinar in 7 days' time, so please stay tuned and keep visiting AAYAKA website for further information. Thank you all.